Welcome to the Hale Sports Podcast for today. We've got a special guest who has spent 25 years as CEO of 3 AFL clubs and been around the industry his whole life, Cameron Schwab. Welcome from Melbourne. Thanks for giving us a little bit of time today.
Thanks, Luke. I'm looking forward to it. I, as you know, developed a relationship with the school through Kenny Moyer, who became one of my great mates and introduced me to cycling, and I've been riding a bike ever since. Had a great period of our lives in WA, so it's a pleasure to be a part of it, and obviously a great school and great institution.
Fantastic. Now, also joining us, we've got our school captain, Ethan Batt, who is also a footballer, hopefully been the first 18 this year from Boddington. He's a boarder. And we've got Sam Huxley, a boarder who played first 18 last year from Dunsborough. Now, boys, I'm going to throw it over to you. Ask some questions of Cameron. Let's see where this conversation ends up about, his views on leadership, his experience in leadership, and how it can help all the boys listening at home.
Yeah, so Ethan here, Cameron. I just want to follow your journey a little bit. So at 24, obviously you're appointed to Richmond as the youngest CEO ever in AFL and VFL history. Can you talk us through the journey that kind of led up to this appointment?
Yeah, it's and it was a journey in itself, but a relatively short one. I did grow up with the game, and my father, Alan Schwab, was the secretary of the Richmond Football Club, which would be now known as the CEO. So I had three or four occasions that I can remember waking up on a Sunday morning to switch on the telly to watch the Thunderbirds or whatever was on the telly at the time, and the Richmond Premiership Cup that they'd won the day before was sitting in our lounge room. It was quite a unique upbringing in lots of ways, and as a result of that, I probably had an insight into the game that most young people don't get, and also was surrounded by some of the most influential people in the game at that time, and including a wonderful coach at Richmond by the name of Tom Hafey, who ends up being one of the icon figures in the game. And so I lived that journey, and it was fairly complicated upbringing in some ways, whereby people knew you by your name before they knew who you were, because my father was a well-known person. So I was the son of, and then because I loved the game so much, and with really no real certainty about what I wanted to do when I left football, I left school, I ended up getting a job as an office boy at the Melbourne Football Club, and then found myself working next to another iconic figure in the game, a fellow by the name of Ron Barassi. And so I've gone from Tom Hafey to Ron Barassi, who are two of the biggest figures in the history of the sport. And by, again, situation and circumstances, one of my first jobs at Melbourne was editing Ron Barassi's tapes for him, which was at that stage, it was prior to digitisation of tapes. And then I found myself in conversation on a daily basis with Ron, and built a relationship. And then quite quickly thereafter, because of that relationship, I found myself recruiting and watching players and trying to build football teams. And Melbourne, during that period of time, we made the finals for the first time in around 25 years, and a number of the players I'd recruited, and therefore built probably a little bit of a reputation in my own right, as well as obviously having the surname Schwab, which was a big thing. And then the opportunity, I got a tap on the shoulder when I was watching a game just at the Junction Oval in St Kilda. And it was the board member of the Richmond Football Club who asked me if I was interested in being the CEO. And in many ways, I couldn't believe it. I was only 6 years out of school, really, and it was the only job I'd ever had. And I remember ringing my dad on the way home and asking him whether what his thoughts were on it. And he was then the executive commissioner of the AFL, so he'd gone on to bigger and better things as well. And he asked me whether I thought I could do it, and my first instinct was that I couldn't. And then he asked me if they were offering you the job as the CEO of the Essex Heights Football Club, do you think you could do that? And Essex Heights was a junior football club I'd played all my footy with. And I was really dismissive of his question, and I said, yeah, of course I could. And I remember him saying, do you think that's an easy job, do you? Do you think it's an easy job running a junior footy club? It was almost, he was being, again, putting me in my place a little bit, but also making the job accessible, because he then said that it's the same job in many ways. It's obviously the issues, there's more zeros on the end of the checks you'll be writing and all those sorts of things. But But at one stage, he kept me very level-headed about the opportunity, but at the same time made the job accessible, and I accepted the role. And I spent the next 6 years in that role, and it was way before my time, no doubt. I was really just finding out who I was as a human being, let alone trying to work out who I was as a leader. And it was probably also that if someone had said that at the start of your career you get to have one job in your whole life, what would it be? And to be the CEO of the Richmond Football Club would have been that one job, but I was doing it when I was 24. And so it was just a huge learning. We were no good. We were a poor team. We were broke. Every decision that we had to make had consequences. And it was a deep learning experience for me personally. And I've got to say that at different times I made a mess of it. And but I wouldn't change it for anything. Wouldn't change it for anything.
That sounds incredible. Really. Just one question, obviously, for me is a lot of people, you get born leaders as such and stuff like that, but there's a lot of people like myself, I found, especially in year 11, that there was just one moment where it kind of clicked for me that I wanted to be a leader as such. Did you have a moment like that, or were you, to say, a born leader through school and outside of school and what?
No, I couldn't. I never led anything really. I was a mid-range player. I played a lot of football. I played a lot of sport. I really was always very attracted to team-based environments. But I was never. I'd win the coach's trophy. I wouldn't win the best and fairest, put it that way. You know, it was, but I felt probably because I'd been close enough to the people who I mentioned before, including my father, Tom Hafey, Ron Barassi, I got to see the human side of them relatively young in life. And because of that, I felt that there was nothing, if you like, the charismatic aspect of what I assumed that they had. I saw the human failings as much as I saw, you know, obviously the great strengths. And because of that, I felt that leadership was at least accessible to me. It was a step that I could take. I was never overtly confident in my way. I built a confidence around some aspects of what I felt that I could offer, as in an expertise that I'd developed, but certainly not as a leader as such. So it was very much a developed person. But I think probably where I was I had a very strong influence with my father, obviously. My mum was also a very strong person in my life, and she would regularly push me to go deeper into my thinking. Like if I wanted something in life, I'd come home and say, this is what they want, or this is what they're doing. She'd always go, tell me about they. Let's go deeper into they, you know. And that seems a really simple approach, but it was basically, am I just rolling with the numbers here, or are you prepared to have your own take? Are you prepared to have your own view on this? And so when I came into leadership, I was clearly heavily influenced by the people who had influenced me, but I think there was just a little part of me which felt that I could do it in my own way as well, in a way which was more, if you like, complementary of my personality and my way. And as that time went on, I got to do it for a long period of time. More and more of that came out. The biggest mistake I made early was trying to lead like someone else, was trying to lead like, you know, Alan Schwab or Ron Barassi or Tom Hafey. And that was very much a command and control way of leadership, to be honest. You know, that was the generation where basically you expected your leader to stand at the front of the room and tell everyone what to do. And I never felt comfortable in that way, because I never felt comfortable I was the most knowledgeable person in the room. And so that took me to have the confidence to actually walk into the room and say, I don't have the answer here. Once I felt that, I knew that I was probably a bit of a chance. I was on track. Might be just worth muting yours, Luke, I reckon.
Yeah. Let me.
Yeah.
Just going back to your journey a little bit. So after Richmond, you were appointed CEO of Melbourne in 1997. What kind of things did you take away from the job at Richmond, and as you said, from your father and other leader figures in your life?
I think probably the most. I was a more formed person during that time. I also became a parent, and parenting is, I'd say, the most challenging leadership role that you can have, and I think even having that experience and trying for the first time. I'll put it this way: often people will talk about leadership and the decisions that you made, particularly in sport, where your decisions are up for grabs. You know, you're leading in a way where people are going to sit in judgment of your decisions. And people will say, did you recruit the right player here? Did you sign the right coach here? The things I reflect on aren't whether I got the decisions right or wrong, because clearly you're going to get stuff wrong a lot. The things I think about are where, almost with, and shame's a very big word, but there is a little bit of this in what I'm about to say, is I think about the times when I never showed enough courage, where I knew that it was up to me to step into this conversation. It was up to me to step into this place, even if it was against a pretty strong view from others, or even if it was a values-based conversation where perhaps, you know, particularly in male-dominated environments and environments where you know, it sits on the cusp of all things East, you know, racism, sexism, all those sorts of things. I think about the times I didn't show enough courage. I think about the times when I let my ego take control, where I made it much more about me than it should have been, and where humility really was what what was required at that time. And I think the great thing about the generation that you guys are coming into is that there's a real value on humility when it comes to leadership. Well, there was none of that when I was growing up in leadership. It was all about the powerful man at the front of the room. And whereas that's a very one-dimensional take on things, particularly if the powerful man at the front of the room is operating without courage and without humility. And the final one was when I got angry and I let my temper, or I let my, and often they were happening around about the same time. And so if the three things that I'd always seek as a leader to keep in check would be, you know, am I making the hard call here? And Alan Jeans, who's another guy I got to work with, is a wonderful coach at Hawthorn. He used to always say, your first loss is your best loss. You've got to confront. You've got to be prepared to put yourself into that space. You've got to think about, are you operating with humility, and is it, you know, are you responding in a way which is calm and as it relates to whatever the situation is? And because of the circumstance, where I got 6 years to practice that, if you like. And so by the time I got to Melbourne, I'd at least learnt that. But I'd also say it was a stage of life where, you know, again, with some reflection, I think my ego was too big a player in the way that I tried to lead during that time. And I have regrets as far as that was concerned. And in the end, I got the sack. I got the sack as CEO of Melbourne. And in some ways, you know, that was, you know, there's a way you could look at that. Was that fair? Was that right? Was that, you know? But really, I look at it now and say, well, if I'd managed myself with greater humility, I don't think it would have ever happened.
So your next stop was at Fremantle, and that was a very young club. So
yeah,
how did you approach that, I suppose, differently, seeing so you could make such a great change at probably a younger club? Did you bring a lot of that, or try to bring a lot of that humility into the way you led that club? And what were the challenges you faced during that time?
So I was in my mid-30s by that point, but I was in my mid-30s, but brought 10 years of leadership experience with me, and 10 years of and 15 years of experience in the game. So it was probably really, if I'm primed really in lots of ways but it was a leap of faith from Fremantle's perspective, because they were employing someone who'd been a sacked CEO only 12 months earlier. So it was a humbling experience as much as anything, and also a leap of faith from their point of view. And I wanted to honour that. I remember when I sat on the plane and I was coming over, and I moved over here before my family. I moved over to Perth before my family did. And I remember writing down 3 questions in the plane, and they've stayed with me forever. And I use them now as part of my leadership teaching. The first one is, what does the role expect of me? What does this role expect of me now? And clearly it was a young club, but it was also building on one of the strongest and the most powerful sporting traditions in the country, in the Fremantle football tradition. You know, that it goes, it's as deep and as long and as powerful as the game itself. And I understood that because of my recruiting background. I used to come and watch the local derbies back in the day, and so I really wanted to reflect that. I felt that the Fremantle Football Club hadn't, in the modern incarnation of the Fremantle Football Club, embraced was the wrong word, hadn't really created an alignment between what Fremantle meant traditionally and historically in the context of a modern AFL environment. And the second question I asked myself is, what do I expect of the role? You know, what do I need from this role for it to be the things that I need, you know, to give and have a commitment to something which was going to be as big and as challenging. And that included the fact that I was bringing my family from one side of the country to the other, that there was going to be some ups and downs. We were going to have to travel every second week. It's a tough job, and it's and I was the Eastern Stater coming over to be the CEO of this club. So you're an outsider coming into that environment. And the last one was, well, you know, what do I expect of myself? That's the third question. So what does the role expect of me? What do I expect of the role? What do I expect of myself? And what do I expect of myself then comes back to the 3 things I talked about before. Can I handle this with, can I stay calm? Can I manage it with humility, lead with humility? And can I lead with bravery? And probably I was my own worst judge of that. And because I knew ultimately I was only going to get the comfort and the satisfaction from the role as if I could actually, assess myself against those 3 things. And I can't say, you know, there'd be times, it depends on who you ask, but there'd be times where you certainly failed those. But I think over time, and also brought clearly the just the experience of having to rebuild in tough environments previously, and I loved it. You know, we had the time of our lives. You know, we got to experience things that to see Fremantle make the finals for the first time, to see our first sellouts, to get, we got to a prelim final one year, to see some of the best players in the game come through, to see Pavlich, Luke McFarlane, Aaron Sandilands, David Mundy, to actually to watch Peter Bell up close, that was, and to watch, we created the Purple Haze, and all of this stuff all emerged during that period of time. And to walk away, 7 or 8 years later, I felt that we'd achieved, that the club was on track to be the sort of club that it can be now for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And to build that, knowing that, perhaps I could have stayed longer, but I had reasons to come home. But to know that the club was at least had a platform for the next generation of Fremantle people was something I was very proud of.
Yeah, absolutely. And just going back a little bit, obviously you had your parents, and you were talking about those other role models you had growing up. Who was someone either a CEO, front office leader in sport, or just someone in general that you really looked up to as a leader?
Probably the most powerful figure in my life is my wife. My wife Cecily certainly she's that. In the context of leadership within the game, Alan Jeans was that person, and I only got to work with him for 12 months, and we recruited him as coach of Richmond in the early 1990s, so a long time ago, and he signed a 4-year contract, and it was a big deal at the time for him to come to Richmond, and we sacked Kevin Bartlett, who's an iconic figure at Richmond, played over 400 games as coach, and I was close to Kevin, and it was a difficult thing. I haven't spoken to Kevin since. It's still something which always sits there, and I got to know Alan really well, and Alan was close to my father, and then my father died suddenly, and he died in a way which was it's almost impossible to describe in some ways, where the story was probably bigger than the person in lots of ways. He got drugged by a prostitute, and that's how he died. And he was the executive commissioner of the AFL. And I was CEO at Richmond, as young CEO. And Alan Jeans, in many ways, whether he took that personally or he saw the need, basically realised that there was a gap in my life and sought, without ever trying to be my father, he sought to fill it in a way where he realised I still needed it. And I went through, when I got sacked as CEO of Melbourne Football Club, I went through a very difficult period. I was diagnosed with clinical depression, and that was at a time of life where a generation of men who that was never talked about. And I've only started talking about that publicly in the last couple of years, because I never wanted to be seen as a CEO with depression, but it's been in the background of my life pretty much for the last 20 or 30 years. And I went through a difficult period, and Alan was the person who made a choice to do what he could to pick me up. And he did that. And and the line he uses, it's not how you get knocked down, it's how you get up, is one of his famous lines. It's not how you get knocked down, it's how you get up. And he helped me get up. And by sort of dusting myself off and finding a way and getting the right sort of support, the right sort of help, the help of my wife, I then had 6 months later, I then got the opportunity to go into Fremantle. So that was the background to the Fremantle role, and got my life back in order again. And to have someone who and it could be just seen as a pure act of friendship in one way or another, but also people who can help you not only need to have, a deep care and love and want to help you personally, as in they do care for you in a way which is bona fide. They're not doing it for reasons of their own selfishness. But secondly, also have the acumen and the insight and the understanding and the experience to actually help you as well. They're really rare people in your life who have those two things, that they want to help you because they care for you, and they can help you because they've got the expertise and understanding. Well, with Alan Jeans, I had both. And then in 2011, I get a phone call, and I look down at my phone, it's Alan Jeans on the phone. And he says, I want you to speak at my funeral. And he was managing the last phase of his life. He was saying, these are the people I want to talk. And he basically what he was asking was me to represent Richmond Football Club. And I was CEO at Melbourne at that time. And he said, because I want people to understand that Richmond were good to me. And I've never been able to say that in my own right. And so it was obviously a big funeral. He's an AFL Hall of Fame person. And he coached St Kilda's only premiership. He was Hawthorn's coach of their great generation with Dermot and Dipper and all these guys. And then he coached Richmond just for 1 year. So I had to get up and explain that story for Alan after he passed away. And to have people like that in your life and to meet people and to be given the privilege of having that, the generosity that he had, but also the insight to recognise that I was a person who needed that help at that time, is arguably as powerful a thing that's ever happened to me.
Thank you very much for sharing such a deep insight into your, I suppose, journey through leadership. I'll hand over to Sam now for more questions in leadership in football specifically. But thank you very much.
Thanks, Ethan.
Sure. Gonna more move on to, I guess, like more some leadership like within the football world, I guess.
Yeah.
So to start off, from just I guess, like, how have your views, like both from a player's perspective, coach, and I guess like the management standpoint, I guess, like, how's that changed over time, do you think?
I think it's changed. I think we're seeing a lovely, and the term I used before, the humility, starting to come into it now. So if I speak about leadership now, everyone loves the notion of authenticity when it comes to leadership. They say that I want to be an authentic leader, and it's a nice little tagline. I want to be authentic. Well, you can't be authentic without being vulnerable. You can't be authentic without actually realizing or revealing part of who you are. And part of who you are is not the person riding in on their white horse with all the answers and looking like a legend. Part of humility is the pure aspects of vulnerability. And vulnerability, I often talk about sort of the three components of vulnerability, or almost the three strategic advantages of vulnerability. Is that first of all, you can walk into the room as a true version of who you are. You don't have to put on some sort of mask. You don't have to try and create some version of you each time you walk into the room. You can actually just say, this is who I am. And sometimes, that means, I do have to, put, shoulders back, head up, that does become part of it. You do have to, get yourself ready for that. The second part of it is that stuff happens in our lives of which we've absolutely got no control over, like just none. And, the world that we're living at the moment, the four of us have no control about this life, but we do have a control about how we respond to it. That's one thing we do have. And, and I mentioned this to Luke when I caught up with him, but in February, I found out I had cancer. So I've had surgery a month ago to have my prostate out, and the timing probably couldn't have been better in some ways, in that. But I have no control over that. That's just something that my body's done, But I do have a control over how I respond to it. And the third aspect of vulnerability, which I think is really important, is that it actually is an invitation for people to help you. It is you're creating a space for someone to say, look, I can help you with that. And probably it took someone the power of Alan Jeans to almost bust open my door, because I wasn't creating that invitation for him. He's basically looked at me and gone, this guy's in terrible trouble. I need to help him here. I don't know what to do. Whereas if I'd actually let myself to be open during that period, there was probably 1,000 opportunities for other people to help me, which I wasn't prepared to own, because I wasn't prepared to own up to the fact that I wasn't well, and particularly in that way. It's much easier to say to people you've had cancer than you've had depression. It's a weird thing. And so I'm now seeing that, where you get to see, Damien Hardwick or even Nathan Buckley, as powerful and strong a personality as he was, he puts this value on it. I ran into Nathan just when we were going for around the Botanical Gardens recently. We just started up a conversation, and we've had about 10 little exchanges of texts since. He's a guy who I hadn't had a heap to do with, but there's a beautiful openness in the conversation that we're having. And I think compare that to the Nathan Buckley of the strong-willed, powerful, we're seeing a different person now. And it's a much more generous and decent and giving person. And the good thing is, in real leadership, is we're seeing that now, and we're responding to it in a positive way. Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, we're responding to that. We like that. Compare that with Donald Trump. It's just a way of which we now can look at leadership and go, I can relate to that person. I know that person cares for me. And if nothing else, that gives us the best chance of eliciting good performance, and that's ultimately what we're trying to do with leadership anyway.
Okay, that's really interesting. Thank you. Going to move on, I guess. Obviously, you as the CEO of a footy club, because how much of your performance and daily life, it's probably a big question some people ask, but how does your performance in your daily life, how is that judged by wins and losses on the field, and how did you manage to, I guess, like ensure a balanced life outside of work, particularly when I guess things were tough?
Not very well would probably be the answer. Not as well as I could have. I think I was always around, but I wasn't often present in some ways. And so, one, I don't believe in balance as a thing. I know it gets talked about, but I believe in confronting the tension between everything. So there's a wonderful writer by the name of David White, Whyte, and I love his work. And he's got a book called The Three Marriages. And he talks about the first marriage being the relationship with that person and the vows and everything which everyone thinks of marriage as being. Then he talks about the marriage to the work we do. And then he talks about the marriage to self. And he says, as a poet, he would never use the word balance because it's too obvious and therefore can't be trusted. It's like an obvious thing. And because we're all running around trying to find this thing called balance, we're banging ourselves up when we don't find it. But it's actually recognizing that often ambitious people are going to find that they're in a situation where there's going to be tension. And that's going to be tension between what you need to do to get ahead with your work, what you need to do to be the best parent you can be, what you need to do to be the best partner you can be, all those sorts of things. There's going to be a tension. The danger is if you actually ignore that there is a tension. And so I write down, I start the day, I believe in this thing called a personal trademark. So I write down a personal trademark each day and I use the word finding something, or the words finding something. And that came out of my experience with Alan Jeans. It's not how you get knocked down, it's how you get up. So I had to find something. And so find something was obviously the effort to do it, but it was also, I had to find the system, I had to find the way, I had to meet the right people, I had to learn, I had to grow, all those things. And the 5 things I write down is, the first one is just do good work each day. Try and do good work. I don't say do great work, because I reckon if you do good work consistently, great work pops up from time to time. The second one is stay organised. If you become disorganised, you can't achieve anything. And so this notion of leadership and management, I've never met a good leader who was a poor manager, but I've met managers who weren't great leaders, because you can't give yourself a chance. It's like when your work gets disorganised at school, all of a sudden there's a tension around it, isn't there? I'm just out of control here. You're not going to get the best stuff out of you, best work out of yourself. The next one is enjoy and look after myself. Have fun. So if I want to do this, if I'm doing this podcast, I'm going to give it a bit. I'm going to give it my energy. I'm not going to just go low-key, and I'm going to think about it. But I'm also going to look after myself and exercise, and I take a lot of pride in those sorts of things. The fourth one is be present with family and friends. And so it's this notion of being present is the key one. You've got to be with them, not just in the room with them. And the fifth one is find a creative space. I'm a big believer in creativity. I'm a practicing artist. I like writing. I enjoy speaking. These things, there's a creativity associated with it. So if I just then give that little checklist to myself each day, and I know that I'm roundabout in all of them, I know that I'm on track. And and so all I would say to people is, what is your little trademark, you know? And it's basically asking yourself, okay, what's important here? Because what's important isn't the first email in your inbox. It's not text. It's not Twitter. It's not Facebook. It's not TikTok. It's not whatever. It might be the conversation with your mate you haven't caught up with, who needs to hear from you. And are you going to make that effort today? So it's bringing it back to, and I'm a big believer that we don't rise to the level of our ambition. We fall to the level of our systems. If we're badly organised, bad systems in our life, then you won't achieve what you seek to achieve. So if your goal is this thing called life balance, okay, what are the components of it, and where's the tension going to actually sit? And I made a mess of that a lot because footy's so demanding. It's in your face. People want to talk to you about it all the time. It always seems the most important thing, but often it wasn't. And I've become much more conscious that my decision making became more conscious as time went on, but I still made a mess of it a lot.
Mm-hmm. Sam, I might pop in here with a question if I can, Cameron. One thing I think I struggle with personally, and particularly student leaders struggle with in sport as well, is this balance between honesty, and then also you get the message about trying to be positive at all times, but honesty can lead to negativity. Now, I found it fascinating. I'm watching the test at the moment, the documentary, the Australian cricket team, with Justin Langer, who we spoke to.
It's fantastic, isn't it? Great.
I loved it. I don't watch 2 episodes in a day just so I can digest one episode at a time. But he's I think honesty screams out of his veins. But then he's got feedback. You know, I think Usman Khawaja gave him feedback. Oh, you're being too negative. So how do you balance that? Sometimes people think honesty is too negative and you're glass half empty kind of person. What are your views on that?
Yeah. Well, fundamentally, feedback is a core element of learning. It just is. It sits at the very heart of learning. So, but the hardest thing about learning is being an unlearner. Are you prepared to be an unlearner here? So even and often I'll say to people, is it harder to get feedback or give feedback? And I actually found it harder to give feedback. I found it a bit, I was okay getting feedback, but say if you're going to give me feedback, I'm going to give feedback, is the first thing I'd ask is, can you back it up? Can you back it up? Don't give me feedback because you've got some random thought. You need to be able to back it up. So if Usman Khawaja is saying to Justin, you're being too negative, and I saw that, and my take then would be, and I can't remember exactly what he said, but I think he was a respected person within the team environment. He would be, because you did A, B, and C. This is my example of you. Yep. The second one would be, okay, you go, can you back it up? The second one is what you're saying important, or you just got the shits? Let's not beat around the bush here. If you're going to give me feedback, it needs to be important. Don't give me feedback on stuff which is not important, particularly in environments such as the one they're operating in high performance. But I'd get people, if we lose 5 games in a row, you should see the emails you get, the texts you get, and the whatever. Everyone's a bloody expert, and it's changed the flavour of the cordial sort of stuff. That's what's, and I call it cure-all. And the third one is it coming from a good place? Like, is it coming from a place of decency, generosity, humility? Does it need to be said? And if you can back it up, it's important, and it's coming from a good place. Well, it doesn't matter if it's got barbed wire all over it. It still needs to be said. But also, I would say, if you've got something positive to say where you can back it up, it's important and it's coming from a good place. Well, tell me that as well, for goodness sake, And that's a much easier conversation in lots of ways. And often that can be when we're coming home, we're having a cup of coffee together. Whereas the other one might be a bit more full on, as in, no, I need to sit down and have a conversation here.
Yeah.
But it's when you can't back it up. And so the thing I noticed about the test stuff is that the most powerful aspect of the program, I thought, was Justin's own personal reflections. Because he came into that, he had really good respect within the team. Yeah, there's actually that part where they said that we've got a doppelganger or whatever it was, where they came in and it was Justin Langer who'd come in and they didn't recognise him because he had a smile on his face. You know,
I watched that an
I'd
hour
say
ago at the end of the Sri
did you?
Lanka
Yeah,
test,
yeah.
Nathan Lyon. I watched that literally about an hour ago, yeah.
Did you? Yeah, and so that's great because I love that, and I go, and if someone had said that, I go, yeah, that's a really edgy little thing to say, but that has all the three things in it, doesn't it? You know, in one little statement there, because basically I reckon it was the boys have all got their heads there and go, geez, I wish you'd smile a bit more, you know.
Yeah.
And Damien Hardwick's really interesting with that because he talks about, you know, his own reflections as a coach and how powerful they've actually been in terms of his own learning. And the most powerful learning we can do is the stuff in our own quiet time, you know, our own personal reflections. But unless you're actually getting regular feedback from those who you trust and have watched you in action, the hard thing from being a CEO's point of view is not many people watch you in action in lots of ways. You know, you're and coming back to Sam's question, how you judged, you know, if the team loses, but you make $1 million, you know, you still haven't done your job. So it's not one or the other. Your job is to do both. But the hardest thing about being a CEO of an AFL club, because I come from a football background probably too, that, you know, if I'm watching the game and we're getting beaten badly, and I drive home that night, there were times I'd look at my wife and go, am I making a mess of this? Am I stuffing this up? How come we're so bad? You know? And then you win the next week, you don't have that. Everything's okay, you know. So, but high performance will always draw that out of you. So I would say the answer to the question is that my job is to create a strategic and cultural platform which gives us the best chance of performing well. And so therefore, you know, I've got to get the right profit model into the organisation. I've got to bring the right people in, and then hopefully appoint the right coach. And then you give that the coach, you say, and the right recruiting guys and all that, and say, okay, it's your guys. Now you've got to get this done. And the only thing I wanted to know as CEO from the coach in particular was I want to know what the plan is. Tell me the plan. And I want you to know, if you can't articulate the plan to me and the board, well, there's a big chance you can't articulate it to the players. And that would worry me. And so the plan might be, we're not going to be any good for 3 years. Okay, so all right, so that gives me then a chance to say, well, I'm going to have to be a pretty fierce defender of poor performances for the next period of time, because you can't fast track some of the things that we're talking about here. You can't fast track, you know, you can't turn a 10-game player into a 70-game player without the benefit of, you know, 3 or 4 seasons. You know, that just can't happen. You know, there's no other way of doing it. And the interesting thing is, for all of the measurements in sport, the most important measurements in terms of team success, and this is a measurement in retrospect, is the amount of games played, average amount of games played by the players, but it's the amount of games they've played together, which is the key thing. And so if, you know, everyone said that, like, for instance, Richmond went from poor in 2016 to very good in 2017, and the Eagles have done similar. But the core of the playing group had actually played a lot of football together. And so it was just working stuff out. It's where the team itself starts to develop its own way of operating, its own way of thinking. And it's actually when your team leaders start coming to the coach and saying, I think we can improve this, we can do this better. And you saw that happen with the emergence of Cochin, particularly at Richmond, I think, you know, where he was really up for grabs as a leader. But sometimes you just got to do it for a period of time. You're a much better leader in 5 years' time if you get to do it for 5 years, if you are a learner, if you're someone who's prepared to open yourself up for feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great insight, Cameron. Sam, last couple of questions, mate.
Yeah, sure. I guess, yeah, you kind of touched on it with Cochin there a bit, but in terms of player leadership, who do you think, like, in your opinion, would be the best current leader in the game at the moment?
I think he'd be hard to beat, wouldn't he? Scott Pendlebury certainly has that He's been doing it for a long time. I think he's actually captained more games at Collingwood than just about anyone now. So again, having had the experience of doing it for a long period of time, I think it is the Joel Selwood. Gee, there's some rippers when I think about it. I'm a bit biased because I've got a Richmond background and I know how hard it is to actually be a strong leader in that environment because their supporters are unbelievably passionate. Like it is. Yeah, it's like it's Fremantle supporters on steroids. You know, they are really full on into it. You know, and it's one of those where it turns on itself really quickly as an environment. So the collective of Trent Cotchin, Peggy O'Neill as president, Damien Hardwick as coach, and Brendan Gale as CEO has just been a wonderful one because I reckon they'd have some pretty good conversations together, as well as the ones that we get to see the very strong front that they actually give. I think what they've done is remarkable. You know, to rebuild a footy club which was really on the bones of its bum, and to do it within one generation of people has been a mighty effort. So that would be the people. If I wanted to play with a captain, I reckon it would be him. And if I wanted to work for a club, I reckon it would be Richmond. You know, for that reason, you know, that you felt that you were being judged for on the basis of all the good things in life.
Yeah, I tend to agree. Yeah.
I think you got a pretty good footy club. I know you boys both the Eagles, but I reckon what they've done is been. And I sent Trevor Nisbet to drag the club up from the difficulty and the challenges that it actually had to create something which, you know, again, there's a wonderful humility about it. I didn't see a lot of that when I was there. You know, it was where I think, and it's always been hard in the context because they're so big, they're so powerful, they're so dominant in the market. To actually create a humble footy club inside that took a mighty effort, and it took a fair bit of introspection, I think, on behalf of, you know, the key leaders within the place, and all credit to them because it's a terrific football club, and I think they're well coached, and you know, I reckon they were the team to beat this year, in my opinion, if the season ever gets going again.
Yeah, it'd be good to see, wouldn't it? So you talked a lot about the aspect of vulnerability with leaders. I say, what is, like, in your terms, like, what is the most challenging aspect, I guess, of being a leader that potential leaders may not see?
I think it's the not knowing, just not knowing, because everyone expects you to know, and you don't know, and then you got to own up you don't know when they want you to know. I found that the hardest part. So you're just looking at situations, and you've been beaten 5 games in a row, and someone says, "Is the coach any good?" And I don't know. Has he lost the players? Don't know. People actually ask you when you come into the games, "Can we win today?" And I didn't know. Like, mate, I'm shit ass at tipping competitions, you know. So it's all of this not knowing where people think you should know. But if it's anything. The biggest thing that we're dealing with is if you're actually genuine ambition is about taking a group of people somewhere where they've never been before. And it by definition is very unclear pathway. And in the end, we might have to make choices on some of the people and say, look, you're not part of this anymore. We thought you were going to be, but you're not. And, you know, the hardest thing that's ever happened to me is being sacked, no doubt. But the second hardest is then having to sack people who you like, who you admire. They're the ones where you had the sleepless nights, you know. So I think it's I think a lot of people like the idea of leadership, but in the end, they're not sure. Once they actually get there, I'm not sure whether they're 100% got the appetite for what it actually means. Because sometimes I sacked Chris Connolly as coach of Freo. Well, Chris Connolly was in my wedding party when I was 27. But we actually, when we appointed him coach, I said at the start, there will be a day, in all likelihood, where I will walk into the change rooms after a game and say, look, I think it's over. and we just have to be ready for that day. And that happened. Guy Scotty Thornton had a shot for goal after the siren and missed. We got beaten, couldn't make the finals in 2007 after making the prelim in 2006. And I said, look, I think it's over for you. And he looked at me and he said, I reckon you're right. And we're still friends, because of that. So it's all that stuff, that the not knowing is the hardest part when people expect you to know.
Yeah.
It's about knowing about an unknowable future.
Yeah. Interesting, because a lot of people have to deal with it, and it's they don't know it until it happens, I guess. So.
Yeah, and there's no lack of experts in hindsight in the AFL, So every person you meet, they go, "Oh, you should have done this." You're probably right. Did you think that at the time? No. So,
yeah. Oh, I gotta move on. This is a little bit of a different take. I guess in the age of the internet and social media these days, so many ways to consume information about leadership. I don't know if this is your thing or not, but do you have any a few go-to places that I guess that could provide content?
Yeah, no, I do. No, I've got so I the people who I listen to a lot. So podcasting, I'm big on podcasts, like a lot of people are now. I love Brené Brown stuff, in terms of vulnerability and authenticity. There's a fellow by the name of Dr. Michael Gervais, Gervais, who has a podcast called Finding Mastery, and he's a performance psychologist, and he's involved with the Seattle Seahawks and Pete Carroll, who's a great coach, and he has these great guests. I'm just listening to one last night. He's got the coach of the Atlanta Falcons at the moment, who he worked with at the Seahawks. And his philosophy is there's only three things we get to work on in life, and that's our body, our mind, and our craft. And they're all in combination. And I really like that, that you what is your craft, and finding mastery within your craft. And mine ended up, by situation and circumstances, was a form of leadership in high performance sport, particularly AFL. So I love his stuff. Seth Godin, his insight into it's Godin. I think he's just unbelievably insightful and has ability to bring complexity down to simplicity. I reckon if you start with those three, what tends to happen is that they then recommend a whole lot of other people. You hear who they talk about. When you're listening to the podcast, they'll mention someone else, and you go, I was listening to this podcast by Malcolm Gladwell. So you go and listen to Malcolm Gladwell stuff, or whatever it might be. So this probably ends up being about 8 or 9 that I go to regularly, but they'd be my three starting points. That I just love all their work. But Brené Brown for the conversation that we've just had would probably be the closest, I would say.
You're right. That's really interesting. Yeah, I guess get lost in the podcast world these days. There's so many out there.
You can, yeah. So, and what I would say is, you also, if you listen to a podcast and you really like it, you've got to actually give yourself the time at the end of the podcast, just 10 minutes, just to write down 3 or 4 little notes on what you actually got from it. So when I was watching the test with, on Amazon, that was, I'd write notes afterwards, and then because we totally overrate our ability to remember things. So if you're listening to a podcast you really like, just give yourself 10 minutes to write down a few notes. And I call that, so you come from a place of curiosity where you're listening to the podcast, then you collect just by writing it down, and then you get to curate your thinking through conversation. I recommend writing a lot, journaling, these sorts of things. Then you're sort of curating your thinking. And what I mean by curating is you're taking the new information and you're aligning it with your existing take on the world. And then it becomes a nice piece of your own wisdom. It's not just saying Michael Gervais says this. You say Michael Gervais says this and my experience was that. And so that's a nice combination of the two things. And particularly you guys as young leaders now, because there's no lack of great information and knowledge that you have access to. But what's important to you? What's your own filtering system on this stuff? And sometimes you can just get pushed from pillar to post, and you say, okay, if I was going to lead in a certain way, how do I want to lead? And I just used to come back to, I go, I used to ask myself the question at the start of each day: do I believe in my people, and do my people believe in me? And so then I go, okay, what makes me believable? What do I need to see in them to believe in them? And that all comes from that same sort of thinking.
Yeah, right. Okay. Gonna change it, I guess, to more of a recent topic that's going around at the moment with the AFL. I guess, like, yeah, your experience and path in that industry, I guess. What are your thoughts around the AFL's proposal to change the draft age to 20?
I've sort of fought it all the way along, but I think I was actually wrong, because when I first started in recruiting, the draft age was 15 and a half. That's how. Yes. So we drafted at Richmond a guy named Anthony Bannock as the first pick in Australia, and he was 15.
Yeah, right.
And so no, my sense is that it's not far from it now. As long as people have finished their schooling, and in most cases they have, we've created enough second, third and fourth opportunities now for those who aren't at their peak at 18 years of age. Would it be good to have a year clear? Perhaps, but there's some people who, they almost need to be in the AFL systems at that age. They're ready for it. They've come out of good systems. It might be that, I think Chris Judd would have played 2 years earlier if he'd been in the system earlier, because he was at that level. No, I don't think, my feeling is it's around about right now. If we had a version of a college system, it's not as required, but we don't have that. Yeah. Because if you're a player, depending on where you actually live, you got, if you're living in WA, South Australia or Victoria, your second tier stuff's at a higher level. But if you're living in other parts of the world, you don't get that opportunity. So you miss out on that important development. I think you need to get, we still recognise that being in an AFL club is still part of the development phase of someone's career. We don't expect them to come straight in and play. Some players do. But, realistically, a lot of players won't play regularly for 3 or 4 years until they're in the AFL system, or they're better off being in the system. And then you can get Marlon Pickett, who jumps in at 27 years of age and show that they can still play. So it's not the perfect system. It's not the only system, but as long as we've got a system,
Yeah. Really.
Ethan, do you want to last question, mate? Because I got to fly to a meeting, and I don't want to let the headmaster down in these times. Otherwise, this could be my last podcast for a while. Go for it, Ethan.
Yeah. So this is a bit of a, suppose, curveball for you. Every Tuesday, boarders and staff have a pie day, and often Mr. Bauer has a crack at us for how we eat it a bit. Take the tops off occasionally, cover it in sauce because it's too hot. How do you eat your pie?
No. Sauce bottle right in the middle, a measured squirt. Don't go too hard. It's not about the sauce, it's about the pie. I think sometimes the sauce likes to think it's about them, but it's not. It never has been. The people who take the top off it, mate, they are clearly West Coast supporters. A Freo supporter would never take the pie top off. He'd just take one big bite in. If it's too hot, well, he'd just deal with it in the context of their own mouth, and they might just have to chew on it a little bit longer to let the cooling process, the steam come out of the nostrils for a little while, and then they just go for it. Whereas a West Coast supporter, mate, they'd be taking the top off it and measuring out the right amount of sauce and making sure it was exactly 18 millilitres and all that bullshit. Whereas a Freo supporter, mate, they just don't win.
Yeah. And if they didn't like that pie, they'd probably go down and get someone else's and, go for another pie.
There's always another pie, mate.
Cameron, really appreciate that. In the insight and the dimensions into leadership, personal growth. There's so much. I think it's going to be this podcast will be a great resource for us for a long time to come. Not just something to, I suppose, listen to during this coronavirus period. I think a lot of people will learn a lot. So thank you very much for being vulnerable, for sharing what you've learned. Wish your health the best and the family's health the best in the coming weeks and months. I hope the boys got something from it. And thanks again for giving up a bit of time.
Oh, no,
Thank
it's
you
been an
very
honour,
much.
and hopefully I've honoured it. I think that's the opportunity that we get when we get the opportunity, guys, to actually speak to other people about it. Always make sure you're honouring that opportunity, and that's the goal. So it's been a pleasure. It's a wonderful institution, and great to be a part of it.
Thanks, Cameron. Have a good
Cheers.
day.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.